Not only are we all concerned about the health risks and the security issues that are related to COVID, we are tremendously growing concerned as a society about our economy. And it seems like for many years, I think a lot of us would agree that the economy has not been working for most people, and we're about to enter full blown crisis. And one of the solutions that's been put on the table and is being discussed in the presidential campaign and through many congressional members on the progressive side is modern monetary theory. And we are just so grateful to have the time of Stephanie Kelton, who is professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University. She has been an advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders on his presidential campaigns. And she's a very busy lady right now. So I am just very grateful that you have the time to join us on our little old podcast here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
of
So,
course.
I think that MMT is obviously, last time I spoke to you a couple of years ago, it was growing in popularity and the movement was starting to understand MMT. But now we're seeing MMT on cable news shows, in the mainstream press as a serious policy idea, thank God, to deal with the problems that we're facing in this economy right now. So just a brief overview, like what is this MMT theory?
Well, I think the one of the most important things to understand is that MMT is actually mostly a descriptive project, which is to say that we're trying to explain to people how money and taxes and deficits and debt and all these sort of things, government finance, how it actually works. Not so much a proposal as a description of how stuff works so that people can have a better understanding and through a better understanding, hopefully arrive at better policy debates and through that, better public policy. So it's mostly descriptive. And then once you have a better understanding of how it all works, it allows you to see through some of the myths and misunderstandings that we have about money and taxes and deficits and the national debt so that we can get a clearer picture of the space that's available to us, to policymakers, to run better public policy, more in the interest of the people, right? So that we're not afraid of arbitrary and phony barricades and barriers, but we see where the real limits are and we pay attention to those, but that we're not led astray by wrong-headed thinking about, well, we have $1 trillion deficit in the US projected for this year. And therefore, we can't do anything else with fiscal policy. We have a $23 trillion debt, and therefore, we aren't able to spend anymore. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to help people understand that no, those things aren't true. Okay, so what can we do with fiscal policy, even in the face of trillion-dollar deficits and so forth? And the thing that's important, especially in this moment, is to recognize that Congress can still act, that it still has the power to do what we have to do to save this economy as we stare into the abyss in this moment.
Why is it that those ideas are not true? That we can't pay for Medicare for all because of the deficit. We can't pay for, free college because of the deficit, or, whatever other ideas that are on the table, that progressives keep pushing on.
So look, in the past 7 days, right, we have seen Congress do several things. First, they passed an emergency spending bill in response to the coronavirus. That was $8.3 billion. And had no trouble with that. You write a piece of legislation, you get the votes, you pass it, the spending will happen. Days later, we had another package. The House passed, the Senate held its nose and went for it. That's about $104 billion. So we've got that. Now you know that we have Democrats in the White House negotiating over what looks like it's going to be $1 trillion spending bill. And I suspect that very soon you're going to see that clear both houses and the president will sign it. So we are going to commit to more than $1 trillion in the span of a week uh, without any conversation about who's going to pay for it, whose taxes are going to go up, whether it's going to add to the deficit. Everybody just understands in this moment that Congress has the power of the purse. And that is, it's something that MMT emphasizes, that Congress doesn't need to go around and quote unquote find the money. Okay, we're not on a gold standard. We have a monetary system that affords us a great deal of flexibility. In economic jargon, we would say it's a floating exchange rate fiat currency. It means that the currency is not tethered to gold or fixed to any other country's currency, and it allows policymakers to react in times of crisis just the way that they are, committing to spending money they do not have. And the reason that they can do that is because the authority rests with Congress, the authority to spend, so to commit those financial resources. And once Congress decides it wants to spend $1 trillion or 104 billion or 8.3 billion, that's essentially how it's all paid for. And then the Federal Reserve, which is the government's bank, is responsible for carrying out those payments. And it will do its job, and it will make every single payment that Congress has authorized. So, it's how it already works. And this is just one of those, it's terrible that it's happening because of this deadly virus that's ripping through communities around the world, but it is peeling back the sort of curtain on government finance as we just came out of. We've been going through these debates where we've had Democratic contenders for months on end pushing free college, Medicare for all, which you mentioned, child care, student debt cancellation, and a whole range of other things. And the entire narrative has been bogged down for months around this. Where will the money come from? How will you pay for it? And what we're seeing right before our eyes in the last week is that those questions can always be handled very easily. If Congress is willing to prioritize the piece of legislation, whether it's free college or Medicare for all, and you can gather enough votes to pass that bill, then it can all be paid for.
So, forgive me, I'm a dummy. Are you basically saying that there are no limitations? We can just essentially print money that maybe I'll go as far to say it's almost an illusion? Is that too far?
No, well, so Congress could pass. Okay, this is a really important point, and I want to make very clear that the answer to your question is no. We cannot just spend to infinity. There are limits. But here's the thing: if Congress wrote Medicare for All bill and passed it without offsets, or what in Washington speak they say pay-fors, if you just said we're going to commit to spending another $3 trillion a year on healthcare, we're also going to make public colleges and universities tuition free. We're also going to cancel student loan debt. We're also going to do $2 trillion in infrastructure, or a $16 trillion Green New Deal, or whatever. And you just pile on all these bills and everybody starts voting yes without any offsets. Then what you're doing is committing to spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars into an economy that until a week ago looked like an economy that was fairly close to full employment. Now, if you're trying to authorize massive increases in government spending in a healthy, more or less full employment economy, the constraint is your real resource. In other words, you're going to have an inflation problem. You just can't command all of the real resources you need if they're fully employed already. So there are limits. The limits are in the real economy. But look where we are today. So you've got Moody's Analytics and others now, basically anyone who forecasts the US economy is telling us second quarter GDP growth is going to be sharply negative, double digit negative, 10% drop, 14% drop, 20%, whoever, it depends on the forecast you're looking at. And people are saying that we are potentially on the cusp of something that looks very much like a downturn that is so sharp that it borders on a Great Depression type of scenario. Now, during the Great Depression, the official unemployment rate was 25%. 1 in 4 in the labor force was unemployed. So if you had depressed conditions like that, where you had millions and millions of people unemployed, right? And all this slack, factories, businesses closed, not operating, that is the environment in which you could come in and do big infrastructure spending, big Green New Deal. The problem we have today, of course, is we don't want people closely working together.
Exactly.
Right? So if your economy is giving you the space, the slack to spend big, then you can safely spend big without increasing inflationary pressures. The problem that we have today is we actually need people to stay out of the workplace. We want them in the workforce. We want them to stay on payroll. We need people. We need to support incomes and keep people's right wages and salaries so that they can stay in their homes, pay their bills, and come back online as we get through this thing. But in this moment, we're facing something that's in some ways similar, in some ways very different from the Great Depression.
So, thinking about that, this isn't just a crisis, an economic crisis that the U.S. is dealing with. Obviously, this is happening all over the world. I'm as the Great Depression was. Isn't our dollar sort of related to how other countries manage their economies? Isn't it like our depression? I mean, I'm sorry if this is too out there, but I'm trying to okay, so if we're able to essentially deal with this crisis through MMT, can other countries are not structured the same way? China clearly isn't, and Russia isn't, and maybe not. Yeah.
China's in pretty good shape when it comes to the ability to spend massively to support the economy. They're in good shape. Individual countries in Europe that have adopted this common currency are in a very different condition, right? Very, very different position vis-a-vis their currency. And we saw this after the 2008, 2009 crash, right? When you've got all of these countries who abandoned what we call sovereign currencies, like Greece gave up the drachma, Italy gave up the lira, right? So whereas countries could have ramped up their fiscal policy, they could have increased spending, they could have cut taxes, they could have allowed the deficit to rise to support their economies through the crisis. In those countries that used the euro, they had to go out and borrow in what's effectively a foreign currency to them. And financial markets look at that as pretty risky business because they're looking at a country like Greece and saying, look, if I lend euro to you, how do I know I'm going to get the euro back in the future? You don't have what the US has, which is basically a printing press, right? So yes, and the thing is, and you're exactly right to talk about, the importance of the dollar, not just domestically to people. I owe my mortgage in dollars. I have to pay in dollars. I have to pay my taxes in dollars. If I had a car payment or student loan debt, those are all payable. I have recurring expenses that, as my household, are payable in dollars. But countries around the world have borrowed in dollars. So a lot of countries are on the hook to pay debt that is denominated in a currency that they can't issue. They got to earn it. And it's going to get really difficult for countries that have US dollar denominated debt in a crisis like the one that's unfolding to export goods and services, right? And to sell things in exchange for dollars so they can use those dollars to buy critical imports of medicine, food, energy, and pay dollar denominated debt. The US is I think, unquestionably the best positioned country in the world to get through this crisis. And quite frankly, we should be thinking not just about how we're going to get through and help the American people get through, but also understand that countries around the world that are dependent on the dollar are also going to need some assistance from us.
Relatedly, you see, President Trump. He's obsessed with China, as we know. He was obsessed in his campaign, and last time we spoke, we did a whole part of our interview on China and trade. But in terms of the supply chain issue that we are most likely going to be facing in some way or another, we are extremely reliant on other countries, in particular China, to distribute goods. And it's not just about shipping them and mailing them and carrying them. It's about producing them. Now understanding that China has reportedly, I mean, we're not entirely sure, but it's been reported that they have contained the virus on the mainland, right? But there's still we're reading about the backlogs of orders and supplies that are not being shipped. We just don't produce in our country anymore. We're not manufacturing. So how is that going to impact just survival over the next several months?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds good, right? When you're saying, oh, we can outsource things and allow countries that can produce more cheaply to manufacture things because it benefits the American consumer because we have access to all these cheap manufactured goods from abroad. It all sounds good until you hit a wall like this one and you say, oh, face masks, oh, ventilators, right? All of these critically important things that we desperately need, and not just us. Everybody needs them, right? So you probably saw China sent to Italy millions of face masks and ventilators and other, the kind of attire that frontline care workers need in order to protect themselves as they care for patients that are infected. So, you're starting to hear things like this is the sort of thing that we did after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when we had a mobilization, a mass mobilization for the war effort, and we had to turn auto manufacturing plants into plants that manufactured munitions. People had to come on board. We had to have tanks and guns and uniforms and meals ready to eat and all that kind of stuff. So, people are starting to, I think, understand that we need our companies to step up now. And even people like Elon Musk, I mean, I saw him this morning tweet out, we are prepared. Tesla is prepared to begin manufacturing ventilators. Somebody just has to place an order, tell us to do it, and we can retool. You got 3M committing to producing, many millions more masks, and so we can do this. We have the capabilities. We just need good, smart. This is where it gets tricky, right? Good, smart leaders who can organize and get the trains running on time.
In the coming weeks, just immediate concerns people have is how they're going to be able to pay their mortgages, how they're going to be able to pay their rents. Some cities and are passing emergency legislation to, potentially block evictions for a few weeks or a few months, not pay utilities, et cetera. But that really only affects a slice of the population. We have undocumented people, we have people with green cards, we have folks that are not living at home, we have people who frankly haven't paid taxes. I mean, we have real societal issues here in which if we were to pass some sort of, disperse an emergency UBI, $1,000, $2,000, I mean, neither of those would pay my rent in New York. Let's just put this out here. And many people's rents in New York, just to make it clear. How would that disperse with a government essentially in a form of a shutdown right now because the workforce isn't able to respond to the crisis at hand?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I think that what you're seeing right now is that the government doesn't have a good answer to this. That even if they make a commitment to start mailing checks, that it takes a while to get those checks in the mail. I mean, I'm old enough to remember going to the mailbox and finding a check from George W. Bush, right? Single individuals got a $300 check. Married couples got $600 in the mail. But look, it's the kind of thing that they're talking about doing, right? You get a check in the mail or you get a deposit to your account. Now, if we all had essentially what banks have with the Fed, banks all have accounts at the Fed. If we all had an account at the Fed that could be topped up, it could be done, instantaneously. The Fed could carry out those payments really quickly if we had postal banking and people had accounts that could be topped up. But when we're talking about 20th century technology, mailing people checks and that sort of thing, it does take a while. And then as you said, in order to mail someone a check, they need an address. And so you're going to miss a lot of people who are both unbanked. You got to deal with that. You have to deal with people who are homeless, who don't have permanent addresses. So, the IRS has our social security numbers. They know where we live. They know our last known income. I mean, there surely would be ways that we could figure this stuff out. But I think, you're talking about recurring expenses. You mentioned your rent or your mortgage. And those obviously are varied across the country and across the income ladder, right? So if you're let's say a working professional let's say you're a married couple and each of you is making $80,000 a year. So you're what look to many people to be very high income at $160,000. Now, some of the people who are talking about sending these checks are talking about means testing them. They say, well, if you make more than $85,000 as a household, then you don't get the check. And then you think, well, what happens when a couple like that, because your recurring monthly expenses tend to be higher than everyone else's because your income's higher, so your rent or mortgage is higher, probably have a higher car payment, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the idea that you can just do a one size fits all, everybody gets 1,000 or a couple of thousand, and it's going to keep the lights on, the electric bill, the mortgage, the rent, it's just, it's nowhere near sufficient. So it has to be coupled with other policies. Like, I think the most important thing we could do, to be honest, is keep people on payroll, but out of the workforce. And that may amount to what is essentially nationalizing payroll in this country for a period of time. If your employer can't meet your payroll, better to have your employer keep you on payroll, let the government write the check and cover payroll. It's the biggest expense by far for virtually all businesses. Cover payroll, keep the worker attached to the job, keep them employed through this crisis, but keep them home where you're essentially being paid to do what we're asking people to do, which is to stay home, right? And to avoid interacting for a period of time.
I have so many more questions. I don't feel like we just touched the surface, but you have to head off to another interview. Just real yes or no, because you don't have a time. We can always pick this up hopefully at another moment. But having been to Greece and having family members there who still are they're suffering with very little money and a very educated country. Let's just be very clear. This isn't necessarily third world. These are people who went to school, took out loans, were doing very well just a few years ago and now are living off a couple $100 a month. So I fear austerity. Are we going to see a disaster capitalism austerity scenario when we kind of get through this?
It's my worst. You're raising my worst fear, Nomiki, because this is what happened last go around. We did a stimulus and we said, okay, it's $787 billion. And it was cobbled together very hastily, not well targeted. It didn't really do the job. We muddled along, but it left permanent, lasting scars on this economy. We didn't keep people in their homes. We didn't keep people in their jobs. And we got cold feet as soon as we saw, as the economy fell apart and the deficit increased, people went into panic mode and thought that the right response was to turn attention away from people and the economy toward trying to reduce the size of the deficit. So that is my worst nightmare because, these numbers are going to get very big. We already were facing $1 trillion deficits this year. I guarantee you they're going to be 2-3+ trillion by the time this is over. And if we're watching that happen and we don't have the resolve to say, you know what, I'm immune to the deficit hysteria. I'm immune. I am going to keep singularly focused on recovering this economy, keep maintaining incomes, keeping people in their homes. And I'm not going to let that flashing light in the corner called the deficit draw my attention away from the things that matter. And I'm going to remain committed. And if I have to go back with another spending bill and another spending bill and another spending bill, I'm going to do whatever it takes. In Greece, what ultimately brought the bond crisis to an end, the debt crisis, was when the head of the ECB, Mario Draghi, uttered those three little words, whatever it takes. And as soon as he provided those assurances that he stood ready to do whatever it takes, everything sort of, you got a big sigh of relief and people understood that at least part of the problem was there was a commitment to deal with it. And we need a whatever it takes from Congress right now.
Couldn't agree more. Stephanie, thank you so much. When does your book come out? I guess we're all going to be June 9th
in the U.S.
June 9th in the U.S. So we can order it online, I assume, because we won't be, hopefully. Well,
thank you.
Make sure to drop your book when you go on. I see you all over the place, but people aren't able to do traditional book tours. I'm getting emails from folks left and right. So yes, please, people need to read your book.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nomiki. You take care.